Welcome. We're glad you could join us for today's webinar, ADA Title II Regulation Exemptions and Questions with Judith Risch. This webinar is made available by the Northwest Higher Education Accessibility Technology Group. Northwest HEAT is a joint project of the Orbis Cascade Alliance and NWAC, the Northwest Academic Computing Consortium. Our mission is to advance our common goal of ensuring that digital services, information systems, learning technologies, and instructional and scholarly resources are equitably accessible to all users. Our overarching goal is to cultivate a community of practice among faculty and staff who support digital accessibility on their campuses. To do this, we provide a series of professional development opportunities, and we share best practices and resources through a knowledge base we collaboratively support. If you'd like more information about the work of Northwest HEAT and how you can participate, we invite you to contact us at info@northwestheat.org. You can also communicate with us through the poll that we will share at the end of this session. Before we introduce our presenter, we will take a moment to share some housekeeping details with you. This session includes a chat, which means you can submit questions to our presenter throughout the session. You can also submit questions to our moderator, Mary Ann. Your questions will be addressed periodically throughout the webinar. This meeting is also open mic, which means you'll be able to ask questions by simply unmuting your mic to ask your question during a Q&A time. When you are not asking a question, we ask that you keep your mic muted. This session includes captioning. You will find instructions on how to access captioning in our Zoom chat. Many thanks to AI Media for live captioning. In addition, we'd like to thank Virtual VRI for providing ASL interpreters today. This session is being recorded. We will send an email notification to all participants when the recording becomes available at northwestheat.org, along with presentation slides. And now we'd like to introduce our presenter. Judith Risch, JD and PhD, is the Title IX and Equity Access Services Special Advisor at Grand River Solutions. Judy brings over 2 decades of invaluable experience from her tenure at the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education. Judy is nationally recognized as a foremost expert in digital accessibility, having served as senior attorney at the Department of Education, where she co-led the Office for Civil Rights National Digital Accessibility Team. Her role involved overseeing a team of attorneys and investigators across 12 regional offices, enforcing digital accessibility policies, and advising educational institutions and business leaders on compliance with federal disability discrimination laws. While at OCR, Judy provided expert technical guidance during the development of the new ADA Title II amendments that cover digital accessibility. She also contributed her expertise to updating the 2024 Section 504 regulations regarding disability accessibility for the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. Judy regularly advises and presents to educational institutions and business leaders throughout the country about how to effectively comply with federal civil rights laws, especially those that relate to disability discrimination, access, and technology. Judy, we welcome you and we look forward to learning from you.
I couldn't figure out how to unmute. I'm sorry about that.
That's
Should be able to use technology. Okay, I'm all at that. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here today. And I was here in May, about I think it was my third day of work at Grand River. And so I was having a hard time figuring out how to get email in, forget about having presentations ready to go. So there is a deck. It's on a Google Drive somewhere for everybody. It's my bigger presentation. I'm not going to cover everything today in the deck. I'll go through some stuff quickly, but I wanted you to have it as my apology for not giving it to you last time because it truthfully wasn't ready because I couldn't produce it in 3 days. So this is like my much longer presentation. So if you're flipping through and you have a burning question and I didn't answer it in the presentation, we can gladly cover it. It's not a problem. I also will spend a little bit of time clearing up things I said last time that I've changed my opinion on. Unfortunately, I didn't want to, but I did. And I can answer any questions you have from last time because Mary Lou and I were hanging out last week at Accessing Higher Ground. So I'm pretty flexible and laid back. I can't see the chat with the configuration I have at this moment. So I'm going to take a break occasionally and just be like, are there any questions? But I'm a fairly flexible presenter. The main goal today is to really focus on the 5 exceptions and non-conforming alternatives. That is my main goal, but I want to go through some other things quickly. And when we were planning, I said, well, so just the first few slides are generic intro things, not legal advice. This is kind of a roadmap, but we're going to skip large chunks. One of the things I also want to spend a few minutes talking about, and we haven't talked about, and I said when we were planning this, we're going to need to talk about the election, and we're going to need to talk about the election. No matter what happened, there's predictions of what's going to happen. I am not an optimistic person, generally speaking, though I try to be. As most people here, I'm assuming have some understanding of the Title II digital accessibility regs, which we'll talk about in a minute for a few minutes, are going to change everything on April 26, 2026. Today, I will say they may or may not happen. I don't know. There are courts. The new administration could go through a re-regulation process and they couldn't happen. But we can't stop preparing because if they happen and you thought, oh, they weren't going to happen, that's not a defense in court. So that's the first piece of it. The other piece of it also is, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about this, you still have digital accessibility requirements today. The ADA, which applies to all public entities, says you can't discriminate, exclude someone from participation and deny them the benefits of a program, of services, programs, or activities that a public entity makes available. And 504 has similar language. ADA, Title II also has effective communication. 504 applies to public entities. So we have requirements of digital accessibility today. It's just that in the Biden administration, they went through the process of creating new regulations that create a very strict standard that I have my own concerns about, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And I'll talk about in a minute, actually, on the next slide. So, but there is a requirement for functionality, usability, non-discrimination, same time frames, equal use. Like I've got slides about all of this here. I'm not going to cover them too in depth. I don't think I do actually. But like there are still requirements today to make sure your products, your activities are accessible. And if the new Title II regs go away, I hope they don't. I think they're really important. But if they do, we still have to make our programs accessible if you receive federal financial assistance or you're a public entity. And the federal financial assistance is your student loan money. There is a but to that I will talk about in a minute. But just, I want everyone to keep that in mind because there could be a legal challenge to the regs. I actually had thought it was going to happen last week and it didn't, but what do I know? That was my spidey sense, but it didn't happen. So I was surprised. So we have out there lots of different accessibility standards and things like that. I'm going to skip the first one and talk about the second two. We have Section 508, which people all the time get confused and say we have to meet if you receive federal funding. That is not the case. 508 is conducted by the federal government or conducted on behalf of the federal government. There's not a ton that's on behalf of. The one place we saw it was like a nonprofit group built a database at the Department of Education about special ed information on behalf of the US Department of Ed, and it was branded like the US Department of Ed. It just had a different URL, you could tell. That is on behalf of, and Section 508 would apply to that. But if it's done with a grant, it is still only under 504, so you can't discriminate. So right now, 504 for education purposes and most federal agencies doesn't have a standard adopted. It's just kind of a usability standard we've talked about before. The next thing we've talked about WCAG, and we'll talk about in a second. There is a WCAG 3.0 out there floating. And I'll be interested to see what it is. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot more like where we are today about usability, but we'll see. It's having a rough time. The committee is having a hard time with it. And just so we also know, Section 508, not only, I forgot to say this, but 508 not only has a WCAG adoption for websites, but also has a whole bunch of information for like accessibility of computer mice, monitors, and other technology. And WCAG only covers websites and mobile applications. 508 has requirements for computer programs like, the desktop version of Microsoft Word and those types of things. So 508 has some more requirements. So I'm not saying if a school says to me, like, we're going to use 508 as a guideline, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense because it covers things that WCAG doesn't. And WCAG, we have a few different versions. There's 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2 relevantly. And at this point, you either need to go in with 2.1 or 2.2. I always suggest 2.2 because it's actually easier to meet, generally speaking. So those are the standards. Are there any questions on like where we are today on accessibility and like what's required today instead of what's coming in the future?
None so far.
Okay. I can't stress enough, we still have requirements. So if these regs go away or someone's gonna be like, well, the election changes this, we don't have to do it. The answer is no, you still do have to do it. And I spend a lot of time saying that. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and really talking about it, but we still have to talk about the regs until they are gone, and they are not gone yet. So we've got to talk about them. So let's talk about the regulations. I've talked before about the Title II regs. They apply to all public entities. It's not your school size, it's about your population you serve. So if you're a school district and you're serving only 30,000 people, you have till April 26th, 2027. Generally, statewide institutions, the state flagship state universities, are serving the whole state. That's 50,000 people, state libraries, those types of things are 50,000. They're April 24th, 2026. And if you're in community colleges, the little research I've done, for the most part, you tend to fall on that April 24th, 2026 date, except two reasons you might not. You're a teeny tiny little county in a very small community college. Based on my not scientific research, at the most, that is 10% of community colleges out there, based on some county information and some other things I've done. But even in that 10%, a bunch of them we have statewide programs for digital accessibility. So it actually adds to that. Like you are then under the 50,000 or more. If you're saying you have statewide programs, it's covering the whole state population, which is a little different and a little confusing. And I'm hearing, I have heard wrong information on this. So it is something I'm concerned about. I've also heard a community college consortium somewhere. They serve like 3 different community colleges for an administrative unit. And they called the Justice Line, like, we think we're a special district government. And I'm like, no. Special district governments are things like your water authority, sewer authority, and those types of things, maybe. But even those, we have to be careful. And they're not my clients, so I don't care. But I do know that's what they're talking about based on things they've written. Any questions about the Title II regs and who they apply to, the public entities?
Nope.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Let's talk about HHS. I have changed my opinion, unfortunately. I had a wonderful, wonderful attorney who I worked with and who trained me when I joined OCR a very long time ago. And he said to me, I'm an old man now. I can't believe you're telling me what I said 20 years ago. And so I called him. I said, this is what you said 20 years ago. I think this is what's going on. I don't want this to be the answer. Tell me I'm wrong. And he said, I trained you well, but you're right. So here we go. So I can talk for 3 hours about this. We may get better guidance. I might be wrong. You need to talk to your lawyers is the answer to this question. I don't have an answer. If you get money from HHS, because of the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which I'll flip to really quickly, it's all programs or operations of the recipient. This gets a little complicated. Now, if you're at a public university, this is kind of easy because you're under Title II, so you're like, so what? I don't care. And you move on. Well, two different things. If Title II goes away, you still might have the HHS requirements because these regs may not go away. Though to tell the truth, there were 17 state attorney general led by Ken Paxton on September 26, 2024, that filed a lawsuit questioning the validity of these regs, but nothing to do with the digital component. It had something to do with, in a comment, it talked about gender dysphoria being a disability. That's all I want to talk about. It has nothing to do with the digital component, trying to invalidate it. And it's in the Fifth Circuit, which just does some interesting things. So there is litigation already on these regs. With that said, what it talks about is it just depends how the money comes in. So if we're a major private university with one board of trustees over the hospital and the university, it could be conceivable with definitions, and I have a bunch of tables and different things. If the money from HHS is going to the board of trustees, then all the obligations of these regulations are also going to the educational side of the house, creating and triggering these requirements under, like say the history department their programs need to be accessible and they need to meet these requirements. The requirements are the exact same as the Title II regulations, but I did need to talk about this for a minute. Where it gets really hard is we have a whole bunch of lovely, and a whole lot of universities getting it, but a whole bunch of liberal arts small colleges where they're all about $100,000 grants for student mental health annually. And those all trigger the HHS requirements upon the universities. My opinion is truthfully just turn the money down and get out of there. But the schools don't always want to do that. And for other reasons, we may not want to do that. So you need to look at funding. usaspending.gov is the place to look and see if you have HHS money, and you need to talk to your lawyers and get their opinion. Every organization is structured differently, so there's not a clean, it does apply to you or it doesn't. Every organization is different. And I'm sorry, I don't have more answers on that, but I did want to make sure we talked about that. I have a quote from the Civil Rights Restoration Act. Are there any questions about that? Oh, someone asked, what does HHS stand for? Department of Health and Human Services. For 30 seconds of background, I'm going to make this fast. But originally, Department of Ed, when they talk about dismantling the Department of Ed, I'm like, whatever. It's been going on for years. The Department of Ed was created in the late 70s under the Carter administration. The department was HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, I think, was the Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Ed were one agency. So when the original Section 504, Title VI, and Title IX regulations were all written, they were actually one regulation. And what the wise attorney who trained me told me is he said to me, because we were one agency, we had one set of regulations that through some, procedural things, they just split the regulations in two, but they were the exact same. So all the requirements were the same. So when I started at OCR, for example, we talk about a medical school student complaint at Ed, and it would be about like, I didn't have an interpreter provided to me during my clinical rotations in my 4th year of medical school. I'm just making this up. For the 3rd and the 4th year of medical school, generally OCR would not touch those OCR Ed would not touch those cases. We would send it over to HHS OCR because they did the same thing as us, because the research part of medical school or the clinical part of medical school was more aligned with what they did because our regulations were mirrored. By 2010, we kind of forgot that. Or what else to say? And that those divisions were changed. But you have to go back. So our regulations all mirrored each other basically until 2024, though that's not true. In 2020, when Ed tinkered with Title IX, our regulations did change at that point too. But it's because we were one agency at one point and they were one set of regs. The regulations for 504 at the Department of Education actually predate the creation of the Department of Education. And so that's why there's this weird discord now, because there are actually two different regulations. That wasn't an issue until now because the regulations were always the same. And that's the answer. So that's the simple overview. I said USA spending should tell you it. It could miss something. If you're super concerned, you should talk to your legal counsel. This is not a clean answer. You should there. At the Department of Ed, we did not use USA spending as our only source of information for grants. We had another program that's a proprietary government only one, I believe. So you need to talk to your people and figure out your financials. I can't help you. It's a legal determination, and I'm sorry. Any questions on the HHS piece? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So we're gonna get into the fun stuff now. I'm excited. The stuff I want to do. So this is just citing the regs. Both HHS and HHS 504 and the Title II regulations are very similar. They both say mobile apps and websites. They don't talk about computer programs. They don't talk about email if it's not web-based. It's just websites and mobile applications. So if we talk about some telescope control used by 5 people and it's a specific program installed on a computer, it is not covered under the new Part H of the Title II regulations. That doesn't mean, and I'm going to say this over and over again, it doesn't mean it's not covered by Title II. You're back in the land of what's required today. So in terms of websites, it's your website, your athletics page. A page that stresses me out is like ticketing for whether theater events or, athletic events, all those websites, they've been persnickety in the past. Everything behind the password, the student instructional, the learning management systems, the billing, the libraries, the employee, the HR system, something we're not thinking about very much. All of it's covered, but we get some weird outcomes. So we're on Zoom today. So I'm going to pick on Zoom. It is not because I care. It's just because Zoom is what we're on. There are 3 different presentations of Zoom that I have access to. There is the website based, there's the mobile application on my phone, and there is my computer program based on my computer. Only 2 of those are covered by this regulation. It is the website based and the mobile app. The computer based one is not. And that's why when I talk about 508, maybe keep it in your back pocket. Don't tie yourself to it, but at least keep it there as a guideline and to give you guidance, is because programs like they're computer based are covered under 508. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Questions on that? Okay. So this concept of connecting to the internet is an interesting concept. And some court somewhere is going to get this messed up. The fact that it connects to the internet doesn't make it a website or a mobile application. And the regulation is explicit that it is the web content and mobile applications. So I don't think it's covered, but my suspicion is somewhere along the way, some court is going to get this wrong. So I wouldn't be shocked, but That's where we're at. Because the regulations didn't talk to, that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be accessible. It means it's back under the usability standards we have. There is one carve out in the HHS reg that I am going to tell you need to think about is kiosks. It's an interesting animal kiosks. OCR this year in their year review presentation had a case about a library that had a food area and an unmanned kiosk to pay, and a person who was blind went to use the kiosk and couldn't, and then was left in this terrible situation of, do I walk, I'm kidding but not, across campus to get to something that's opened when everybody else can just use this kiosk? Or do I find someone, a student worker at the library, and give them my credit card and tell them to take care of the transaction, having no idea what the transaction was and putting my financial implications in jeopardy? And OCR said, no, if you're going to have this unmanned kiosk, it needs to be accessible. So, because that's access to the program, service, or activity. So while kiosks aren't in the Title II regs, and the Title II notice and comment talked a lot about how things like we don't have a standard yet, and we don't have this and that, the kiosks provisions are in the HHS reg. They're there for reasons that I find, I say inappropriate, but it's not inappropriate. They should be there, and I feel really strongly they should be there. What was going on is people with visual impairments and manual dexterity problems would go to a lab, a blood draw lab, which had only an automated kiosk to check in and couldn't use it, and would sit there and wait for someone to come to the desk, and no one came for an hour, and people would come in, check in, get taken back, and like they'd be waiting for someone to help them, and no one ever came and did it. And it happened over and over again. And HHS said, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to go ahead and make the kiosks are required to be accessible. In the very few times I've even been to hospitals just to visit someone recently, you're using a kiosk to get in and get a visitor's pass. You put your driver's license in and you get those types of things. They're very prevalent in healthcare, and they are consistently known to be a barrier for people with disabilities. So I think what HHS did was right. I want to say to you, even though they're not covered by Title II, even if you're at a private school and none of this applies to you, you still need to be thinking about the accessibility of your kiosks, because they are a point where everything's supposed to be independent and they're not. And they're then inaccessible to a certain class of people, and there's no alternative access provided. So it's something to think about. But there are two main differences with the HHS regs: the kiosk provisions in terms of digital accessibility, kiosk provisions and implementation dates. And that's the end of it. So any questions on the scoping?
This is Marianne here. I think you addressed this, but just to clarify, I have seen a lot of questions about, well, what if it's just like a software interface? That's not web content, is it? But if it's delivered via a web interface, there you are, right?
If you have a software example and the web interface also, you have both presentations of it, which a lot of software likes that. And they really like their mobile apps too. The web interface is covered. And we're going to talk about conforming alternative versions, which I hate talking about because it's a very nebulous place in the regulation. But I'm going to do it for you all. We can't just say, well, the website's inaccessible, you can just install the program on your computer. That's not okay. And we'll talk about that. And if at the end, after the exemptions, I do have some time set aside for confirming.
And we did get a quick question. Can you give an example of a computer program that is not covered?
So my favorite one is like the controller for a telescope 10,000 miles away. That's a computer program sitting on your computer. But the Microsoft Word computer program sitting on my computer, or here, let's talk about PowerPoint, because I'm on PowerPoint right now, which is what I do. I have the program opened. I don't have the web interface opened, and that isn't covered. So I hope that helps. I know there's some discussion about the HHS reg. Let me, if it's let me take a digression and find. I have to stop sharing for a second because the file I need is actually on this monitor. But give me 1 second. This is going to get hyper technical now, and I try not to get this in the weeds. I'm just looking for a file. Okay, back to Zoom. Fix my screen. Okay. This is getting way down my rabbit hole, and if someone needs it, I can gladly send it to you. Okay, so I'm a nerd. And I got to this thing through the Civil Rights Restoration Act. My mentor came a different way. So the current Ed 504 reg says this part applies to each recipient of federal financial assistance from the Department of Education and to the program or activity that receives such assistance. And then the original HHS reg said this part applies to recipient of federal financials from the Department of Health and Human Services and to the program or activity that receives such assistance. Now, if you go into the HHS application section, this is totally different part. This is 34 CFR 84.2, which was the same original number. This part applies to each recipient of federal financial assistance from the department and the recipient's programs or activities that involve individuals with disabilities in the United States. That is there. It doesn't say programs that receive federal financial assistance. It's program activities that involve individuals with disabilities. That's very, very different than what it said in 1977. And in 2005, there was a small revision. So that's the difference I'm seeing, but it has to do with 45 CFR 484.2, not the digital accessibility things. Because I'm a dork, I went further and I pulled the Title IX regulations and all its different idiot versions of it. And those regulations all talk about educational programs to narrow it. Also pulled the Title II regs, the Title VI regulations, which are pretty old too, and the AJAC regs, which are also have similar tightening educational program type of things. So that's where the reasoning is. I hope that answered the question on that. It's not the answer I wanted, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Judith. There was another question that came through while you were sharing your document.
Sure.
That's does this apply for situations when there are no alternative means for accessing a particular resource? In the kiosk example, I'm thinking about digital wayfinding. There are physical ways of finding maps that are accessible, but we also have a digital wayfinding solutions as well.
So if you have, and it is a mobile app or website based, I assume, I think those need to be accessible under this regulation. And one of my frustrations with the Title II regs, I'll be brutally honest with you, Section 508, the standard that applies to the federal government, says it basically says we understand everything's not accessible. If you go through procurement and you don't find anything that conforms perfectly, you need to select the item that's the most accessible alternative. There's no out for us in the 504 regs that way. And that is going to create a lot of problems. So stay tuned is what I'll say. But I want to talk and spend a lot of time on the exemptions because I think there's lots of questions and I want discussion and conversation about the exemptions, if that makes sense. So first one is archive web content. Now, I'll be brutally honest with you. In my little head, archive web content and pre-existing conventional electronic documents, I personally think should just be one thing. So in my frameworks, I look at them as the same thing, but I want to talk about them for a few minutes. So librarians use a term archive in one way of like a repository of old documents, which this also looks at as a repository of old documents we're not using. The problem is a library archive, you may have a repository of old documents that's being accessed 1,000 times a day because you're using one of the major servers. So I'm going to be upfront. I know there are a whole bunch of librarians here. I think we have a disconnect in the term archive and the term archive. And so Justice has been asked for clarification. If you feel very strongly, go to ada.gov and there's a 1-800 number. You need to call and ask this question. They don't take email, but you need to be asking for clarification on this archive construction. But these archive exemptions, whether it be the old documents created prior to April 24th, 2026, or websites created prior to April 24th, 2026, is intended for things that are just old. My favorite examples are things like old, Board of Trustees minutes from 1998. Yes, universities have them. Yes, they tend to be scanned. Yes, they're inaccessible. And they're never accessed. So if you just move them all into an area and say it's archived, you can be done with it and put a note on and say, if you need access, please contact. And you have a plan for that. I think you can do that and be off the hook. I think it's easy to do in that space. But if it's a document that you've created, let's say we create a web page today about, we make the student handbook a web page today, or no, let's say we make a student handbook in September of 25 and it's inaccessible. We can't say we've archived it off because it's still going to be active on April 24th, 2026. So we need to be thinking about what's still in use. And the same in conventional electronic documents. If you've created, information about financial aid and it's a PDF and everything else, but it's inaccessible or it's non-conformant, it doesn't meet the WCAG standards, it's usable even. It needs to be fixed if we're still using it as part of the program, service, or activity. If that, I want to have questions or things like that. Questions on that, and I will circle back to this question about no alternative means kiosk stuff in a minute, if we need to go back that way, if we need to cover that again. Questions on the archiving exemptions?
No questions coming through in chat.
Okay. Third-party content posted by a third party not due to a contractual licensing or other arrangement with a public entity. So we're all at universities. Let's talk about how does this apply to university? So where do I know it applies? The places I'm comfortable. I've had aha moments. I was in a meeting with a client at one point, and we were talking about how their file system for internal investigations works. And they're all inaccessible scanned documents, but they are only for the student that the investigation's about. Now, if it's for 2 or 3 students, I don't have an answer to this. But for one student, an investigation, and more importantly, because I think this applies to a few people in the room, a student comes to disability services, hands you a paper copy of their documentation of a disability. What's the first thing we do? We scan it and we store it in our repository. It's inaccessible, but that's an individualized document to the student. So I think that's what we're talking about in this exemption in the higher ed setting, are those student documents that are really for each student. Now, this is the answer I don't have, but I hope I'm right. And I might be wrong though. Not a group assignment, not sharing it with the class. I'm turning an assignment into an instructor and he's providing me feedback. And that is the whole interaction. And we're using a web-based word processing program to do it with the comment features. Is that falling under the exemption? Well, my opinion is for now, I hope the answer is yes. But it is, the problem with that is other arrangements with the public entity. And is a student have more of a relationship with a public entity than, you know, a public person? This exemption was created for their attorneys doing this at Justice. They couldn't fathom having a whole lot of lawyers filing a whole bunch of briefs, and then making the lawyers make sure they're accessible, or the court making sure they're all accessible, and they can't because half the time they're scanned. And then holding the court responsible when it's inaccessible. And how do you do that? So that's what this exemption's about. It's like a lawyer's uploading it to the court system. But is a student's assignment between an instructor where no one has a disability and no one has a need that this doesn't work, is that under this exemption? Now, I'm 100% positive. I love this example. We have a communications class. As part of the communications class, whether in person or online, we have students record their own speeches, take those presentations, upload them, have their classmates critique them. If we have a student who has a hearing impairment in that class, I'm 100% positive we have to ensure those videos are all captioned. So that's the student with the hearing impairment has the same opportunity to benefit from the program, service, or activity. That I'm sure of. But if the students are only uploading the video for the instructor, does that need to be captioned? Now, if it's a one-off 3-minute video, I think it should just be part of the curriculum, and they only do it once in the semester. I think it would be a good exercise to make it part of the curriculum. The students practice captioning, full stop, because it's not that hard to do, and I think it's a good pedagogical exercise. Not saying because a student needs the accommodation, because it's just good to learn how to do that. So I don't have answers on some of this still, but my hope is that student work just between the teacher and the professor, and there's no accessibility need there, is under this exemption. Because just think about all those homework assignments and the need to make them accessible. Like, I'm talking student turned in work. Okay, I see Alice, so there's probably a question.
There are actually several questions and comments, many of which are actually, I think maybe people were thinking and then typing related to the archiving question. But there is a question about your current example, I think, from Beth. She asks, in the example describing the presentation, you mentioned that there was a student with a disability who would be accessing the recording. That sounds like an accommodation, but what about if there are no students with documented disabilities in the class, but the presentation will be shared with the class?
It's a good question. I think at this point it needs captioning, though I personally don't agree with that for very complicated reasons, because I'm all about efficiency. And if no one's going to need it, can we just use auto captioning and not stress out too much about it? I had a very wonderful digital accessibility person I've known forever. I was talking to them, and they were like, I'm going to get to commercial grade captioning on 100% of my classes. And I'm like, how much is that going to cost your university a year? And they are like, couple $100,000. And I said, why? Like, you're going to use the video over and over again? Absolutely. You have a student who has a disability that needs really accurate captioning. Great. I said, even if you have a student who's an English language learner and they might need the captioning in there, because sometimes our foreign students need that. We have no obligation to do it, but just in case they're in that group, I don't want them to file a complaint. I said, you can do it there too. But for a class, there's no student with a need, and we're going to use it one time to spend that kind of money. We have other things we need to spend money on. And the auto captioning has gotten so good that I'm not sure it's that bad of an experience. When you start reusing classes and you have students with needs in it, a very different answer. But if we're just doing it so we can post the class and we put a clear statement, if you need better access, we have processes, we have statements, we fully acknowledge if there's a problem with the captioning, we'll pivot, we'll get you better captioning. I'm not into this going the most expensive route for day-to-day purposes. If someone has a need, I'm all over it, and you get the best services then.
Thanks, Judith. I think there's some more questions. I think there was a question about video captioning, and for this one, I was actually was just going to jump into that. I think there's an intent behind these regulations, right? Is the intent is so that someone with an accessibility issue has the proper access, and that they're provided a equivalent experience for materials that are in need. So there was a question that was talking about captioning videos and whether they need to have audio descriptions according to the standards, which I'm assuming are accessibility standards. And that would be, you know, for scenarios, I'm thinking maybe in cases where it's the architecture or geometry, where it's diagrams on a video versus,
Yep.
you know, just a video of a talking head. There might be different contexts and scenarios.
Right. Or there's no talking on it and you're only having sign language interpreters and there's no caption. I'm not making this up. It really has happened. But there's a safe harbor that's a defense in litigation that really is similar to the standard we use today. I just flipped to this. It's access to the same information, engage in the same interactions, conduct the same transactions, and otherwise benefit from the same program, service, or activity as the person, as individuals without disabilities. I call this the 2 a.m. in your pajama standard. If a person without a disability can do it at 2 a.m. in their pajamas, and because I'm a JD PhD, I spent way too long in grad school and worked many late nights doing research on those library databases way back when they weren't so accessible, that if you can do it at 2 a.m. in your pajamas, you need to be able to, everyone needs to be able to do it at 2 a.m. in their pajamas. So I use it, I call it the 2 a.m. in your pajamas standard. It's really not. But this safe harbor is a defense. So if you have a product, you've done everything in your power. It is usable. We know it's not perfect, but it's usable for someone with a screen reader. And I'd even put like disclaimers and be like, if you need more help, please contact us. I do all those things too. You have a defense if you get sued or get an OCR complaint or a DOJ complaint. And I really would document this stuff if you have it. This should not be your default mode. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes more.
I know that we do just a rolling number of questions, and I'm sorry for all of the archive related questions. We might have to come back to that because our time is running out.
Yes.
But I think there is one that is relevant and has multiple applications. Was the compliance, is it only for, what about for the third party tools? But I think it applies to other contexts as well as these regulations. What about for staff versus students?
The way the regulations are constructed and interpreted right now, employee, student, random person, all have the same access requirements. Now, when we get into, I'm going to say the things that no one wants me to say, are we going to be perfect and compliant on April 24th, 2026? How do we pick priorities? I saw this question. It's about risk management. So are we prioritizing the staff stuff over the ticketing system for athletic events? I mean, we've got to pick priorities. And a lot of this is about prioritization because we're not going to be done. And here's the deal. And I'm going to say this to you, you're all in the Northwest. So I do think this is going to come true for most of you. Let's say the Title II regs go away. It just means we can take our foot off the gas in accessibility of going from 100 miles an hour to the speed limit. It doesn't mean we can stop, because there are two different scenarios I see coming. I see one of your state passing a law, and what California does, Oregon does, and Washington does, and Hawaii does. So they're going to pass a state law that's going to put these requirements on you anyway. And you need to, in this way, if I give you 5 years or 10 years, you will actually get this done. The 2 years we had, this is undoable. So that's scenario one. Or scenario two is the federal government and Congress actually does something and also passes a law. And those bills have perked before. Tammy Duckworth did it the first time. We thought it was a joke. And the community were like, what is she thinking? Whatever. The second time it was bipartisan. And I want you to remember the ADA was signed by President Bush. So I think a law is coming. And I'm just telling you 5 years before. I have been talking to people about digital accessibility for over 10 years, 12 years in some cases. And they're actually in pretty good shape, except for two things. They're at WCAG 2.0, because that's when they started their journey, and they missed all their HR systems. So if this doesn't happen, it doesn't mean you can stop, because we still have requirements today. I think we're going to have some version of WCAG enforcement on us because Europe has adopted it too for this summer. I don't think this is going away. So sorry to go on a rant on that. I hope that helped. Is there anything else, Alice, or do you want me to?
There is, but we have 10 minutes left in our webinar, so I
Okay.
want to make sure you can get through what you need
So
to get.
Yeah, third party, I think we've talked about, I've talked about this. Password protected individualized documents, that is actually where I should have been talking about the things like the student files and those types of things are actually individualized documents. I'm sorry about that, but it all falls under these exemptions. I was just too excited about those. The next one is the pre-existing social media posts. This, again, is social media posts you're not using. I use the example. Every year we create a cute little holiday card for the university, and we do it on, it's a video, and it's so cute. And that isn't that would be a pre-existing. Now, if your school spent, $100,000 this year and created an amazing video to show parents how to drop their kids off for move-in day, now that to me is still part of your program service activity, and that does need to be accessible. So just think of it that way. That's the social media posts. I'm going to take a quick breath because I want to talk about one more thing that I dread talking about. So I don't want anyone, I'm going to do one more thing and then we can take questions, and I'll stop the presentation completely. And I'll let it go. The last but not least, I hate this topic, conforming alternative versions. It's 35202. The bottom line is, what is a conforming alternative version is the first question we always get. So two examples. There's a really expensive web accessibility company that'll come in and build you a website where they strip out basically all your pictures and all that stuff and make it purely text only so it's accessible. So if your main site isn't accessible, then they make you this parallel accessible site. And there's some AI things that are doing it pretty well. This is not okay under the regulation unless you absolutely cannot make it accessible. So it is that the conforming, that's the example. So really, if you have that where you hit, accessible version of website, I hate them. Let's just say it. That's where this exemption falls in. So just that's what this, don't do it. You can't do it. The regs say you can't do it unless extreme circumstances. Now, I was talking to someone the other day at Accessing Higher Ground, and they were like, look, we have these PDFs. They're hard to make accessible, of professor content and stuff, but we do upload the Word version also. And the Word version is really the version we want people using. The PDF is there really so when someone prints it prints out perfectly and we can control it that way. Whereas the Word version does weird things. I get it. I understand that. I think that is the place where the main version is the Word version, and then we're doing the inaccessible alternative is just really we need to do it for printing. But again, do this sparingly. Don't do it really. But I think this non-conforming alternatives, if the regulation happens, is going to be a really interesting area. I do anticipate there's going to be litigation because there are a whole lot of vendors out there who are like, yeah, we're not going to make this accessible. We'll just create a whole other parallel program. And that's not really an option under the regs the way they are. There are a lot of questions in this space, a lot of unknowns in this one, because this is a place where WCAG does permit this kind of thing, and we're saying no. So, and Justice is saying you can't do it under the Title II regs. So this is one of the places of deviation. And I think I used to have a whole bunch of slides of predictions on the future. I've taken them out. There are some resources, and I'm going to stop now with 5 minutes.
Thank Judith, there was just so many questions that are rolling in. I feel like maybe we just need a 15-minute presentation and 45 minutes for questions.
And
but
if I don't know about everybody else's availability, I can stay for a few extra minutes if we need to. So I want to
great.
respect everyone's time.
What we'll do then is if we could just do our closing task very quickly. We have a poll, a survey run through a Zoom poll that is being launched right now. Thanks, Marianne. We'll have everybody, if you folks can give us your feedback on the webinar. We'll run this very quickly, and then was it Marianne? If you wanted to share the presentation, the last slide. And then we'll jump back to questions. So it looks like we have our next webinar or presenters with Michelle Bromley and Eleanor Hart from Portland State University. Time is TBD, but I believe once that is available, it'll be on our website so that you can register. And in the event that we do run out of time, what we can do is we can also curate the Q&A, and I think, Marianne, we might be able to send out a summary of Q&A for questions that maybe weren't answered. Judith, if you don't mind maybe addressing any questions that don't get finished answered.
I'll try. And I'm also going to say, if you go to, it's not accessible, don't blame me always, we have issues, or email me. I have, in January, we have Grand River, as long as you have a .edu email. We have a lot of sessions planned with Q&As and stuff in our portal, and we'll gladly, you're welcome, they're free, there's no charge, as long as you have a .edu email, they're easy to get into. And if you can't get in and you need to, because you're a library and you don't have that kind of email, just shoot me an email. We'll figure it out. I have back-end ways to get people in.
Thanks, Judith. I think we have, sorry, I'm trying to rush through everything. We have archive-related questions. We also have WCAG-related questions and third-party questions. So maybe if your choice, which area you would like to jump to.
Whatever you want.
Well, maybe because our archive questions have been kind of lying in wait for a while. There was some questions about moving, sorry, I'm trying to read through everything. Moving content from one area of a site to another seems like a strange user experience. Is it possible to indicate that it's archived, but not make a new archive section of a site? And then there was another question about archiving that I'm trying to locate so we can curate.
So I'll talk and you can keep locating.
Sure.
What my suggestion is if like we have board of trustees in minutes, right? And we're constantly adding, we don't want that page to be 10,000 entries long anyway. We can just say everything before X date archived and on this page, and just have that second page that says it's archived and the link to that. No, but websites themselves, they need to be in a special area according to the regulation. So it needs to be in an area marked archive. But could you have multiple archives on a website? Yes, for sure.
There was also a question about in the LMS learning management system context about if, say, a faculty is going to continue using or has information in an LMS but isn't using it anymore, but it lives out there. Can it be archived and continue to be inaccessible and not need to be remediated? And this was specifically to PDF, but maybe we could speak in general.
So not accessible to students. So if we have a faculty member on sabbatical for 2 years, so starting in the fall of in the winter of 26 and is going to be out until 28, their stuff isn't viewable to the public, I absolutely think that can be inactive. As long as someone doesn't have access to it, it's fine. The same with a web page that's completely inaccessible. If it's unpublished and not out there and there's no way to get it on your website, I think it's fine. I don't think you have to, if you just unpublish it. It just can't be then linked. You can't click on it on your website. This happened at OCR all the time. We'd have school districts and they'd be like, we just took the page down and I'll be like, flick, here's your page. Even if the URL is still live and you delink it, but it was linked in 6 places and you only count 4 of them, that's where leaving the page up becomes the problem, because you could have a link you didn't know about. So I'd be looking for, like, I'd look to be taking it down, but you can keep it on a computer for sure. And people can still go on the Wayback Machine and find it, but that's not your copy then.
Thanks, Judith. And I'm trying to balance things out. There was a question about email. Can you talk about email a little? My campus is in good shape with public-facing content, but are in panic mode thinking about email content, being CC'd, if those need to be
So
made.
email's a funny little animal. So the emails aren't covered technically. So if it's, an email between, Alice, I'm going to pick on you. You and I are sending an email and it's not, and we're using Outlook, it's not covered. It needs to, the portal, if you have a web-based portal, obviously needs to be accessible. Those are accessible. So those aren't something I'm super concerned about, though. WCAG conformance is inconsistent. Strict WCAG 2.1 AA conformance for both Microsoft and Google is inconsistent on a lot of this. So that's a big pressure point unto itself. But the emails aren't technically covered because it's website and mobile application. Here's the problem though. A lot of the email programs that are going on that you're doing, especially the mass blast stuff, is if you cannot see this, please click here, and it's in a website. And then that triggers the website rules. Does that make sense? So if it then opens in HTML, that's then triggered. So, and under effective communication, under your program services and activities, and OCR has found email blasts being inaccessible because they were all image. Under all the other requirements, I still think you should be thinking about email accessibility. That's a problem. If you're a campus and you're worried about something, also just to freak everyone out, and I'm sorry, all the student organizations and what they post is its own, I'm seeing a bunch of heads nodding and smiling, is its own accessibility nightmare. And, the good news is the social media does a decent job, but we have habits, I'll say it nicely. The social media's AI is pretty good on this. I hate AI. If we create a cute little image and we say, bonfire on XYZ quad at 9 p.m., right? And we do a cute little image of a fire and all that, that's inaccessible. And AI at this point on the social media sites is smart enough to figure out that text as long as it's relatively clear. But if it's not, and we can't get that information and it's inaccessible for some reason, that's going to be a liability for the university if it's a student organization that gets significant assistance from the university. As something to stress everybody out, I'm sorry, is where
There's so many different scenarios. We do have several other questions, and I might have missed some in the rolling trail of chat questions, but there was one that was asked quite early, maybe as the last question, since I believe our ASL interpreters will also need to be leaving soon too, is the last question. I've read a lot about the HHS regs, and I haven't found the part talking about how the money comes in, being a factor in who the HHS regs apply to. I know we need to consult with legal, but can you tell me where the helpful information exists? I don't recall whether you had shared the answer to this question earlier or not.
So usaspending.gov tells you where the money goes in. I don't have more information than that. They may, someone at the university may decide it goes into, the money goes directly to XYZ laboratory, and that's getting them off the hook. And that is an interpretation you can go with. This is something that the election made me nervous, though one of my wise colleagues convinced me, and she's right. There's still private litigation, and people are going to go, and the private entity litigation is different rules, and state law plays into it. And I think this is going to be a hotbed of litigation, the HHS 504 reg. So I'd be wrong to be telling you, oh, don't worry about it because the new administration. I am I think this is going to be an area for private litigation because private entity litigation is actually more lucrative than the Title II public entity litigation. And that's why I think there's litigation risk here. Don't get me wrong, but I think the private entity litigation is going to be more interesting, and it's going to just be more common because we see a ton of litigation in the Title III space already in digital accessibility, which is
Thanks.
private entity.
Okay, we'll do one more question if that's okay